Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the night a simple meal turns into something unforgettable when CEO Minh arrives at Sung Thuong's house with fresh pork, grills dinner beside her under the bamboo grove, and then, under the moonlight, opens a small red box that changes everything between them. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning came softly through the bamboo grove, the first sunlight slipping between the tall green stalks and spreading across the yard in pale gold. The thatched house with its clay walls still held the coolness of the night, and the earth outside was dark with dew. Wind moved lightly through the leaves overhead, making them whisper against one another with a sound so familiar it almost felt like a voice. Sung Thuong stepped barefoot into the yard, and the chill of the damp ground rose through her feet at once cold, clean, and strangely comforting. She paused for a second, broom in hand, and looked around. The house was small. The yard was simple. The tasks waiting for her were the same as always, and yet this morning, something inside her felt different. Not lighter exactly, more awake, as if her heart had risen before her body and was already listening for something the day had not yet revealed. She began sweeping. The broom moved over the yard in slow, even strokes, pushing dry bamboo leaves into little rustling piles. The sound was soft and steady, and for a while it became the only rhythm she needed. In the distance, smoke from another household's cooking fire lifted through the morning air. Somewhere farther off, a chicken called, the smell of damp soil mixed with ash and leaf scent filling her chest with the kind of quiet that only countryside mornings know how to carry. When she finished sweeping, she went to the pigsty and poured feed into the trough. The pigs rushed forward at once, snorting and nudging against one another, impatient and alive in their rough, ungraceful way. Sung Thuong smiled despite herself. There was something grounding about animals. They did not pretend. They did not make life more complicated than hunger, warmth, water, and habit. From there, she moved to the small garden. A hoe rested against the wall, where she had left it the evening before. She picked it up and stepped between the rows of young vegetables, loosening the soil around them with gentle care. She bent to inspect the leaves, pushed away tiny weeds, straightened one struggling stem, and watered the younger plants where the ground looked too dry. Every movement had a familiar logic to it. She did not need to think hard. Her hands already knew. That was what she loved most about work like this. It asked for effort, but not performance. It took sweat, but gave peace in return. When she worked with the earth, the old noise in her chest quieted. The past still existed, yes, but it lost some of its power. Regret softened. Loneliness became manageable. Pain did not disappear, but it no longer spoke as loudly. She crouched and picked a few fresh leaves for later, rubbing one between her fingers and lifting it to her nose. Sharp, green, alive. A small smile touched her mouth. If the day stayed ordinary, that would be enough. She could make breakfast later, tidy the table, feed the pigs again, maybe wash clothes before the sun climbed too high. A simple life had its own beauty when the heart stopped demanding more than the day could give. Still, as she straightened and looked toward the dirt road leading into the village, something in her paused. It was a strange feeling. Not fear, not exactly hope either, more like anticipation without a name, as though part of her had already heard footsteps the rest of the world had not yet made. She told herself not to be foolish. She went back inside and wiped the old wooden table clean, her hand moving over the surface in slow circles. Dust came away in faint, pale lines across the cloth. She lit the stove again, coaxing yesterday's dying embers back into life, then added a little kindling and waited for the fire to catch. Smoke rose thickly at first, making her eyes sting. But she did not mind. Even that smell had become a kind of companionship. She washed greens in a metal basin. The water gurgled softly as it spilled across the leaves. She sliced them with calm, practiced hands, every cut neat and even. Once, in the middle of that quiet work, a face almost formed in her mind, not fully, not clearly, but enough to stir something warm and dangerous. She pushed the thought away. Then she fed the pigs once more and returned to the garden. Water droplets scattered from the dipper, catching the sunlight like tiny jewels before disappearing into the leaves. Sweat began to gather lightly at the back of her neck and along her forehead, but she barely noticed. Work had a way of carrying time forward without asking permission. When she finally paused, she lifted one hand to shield her eyes and looked down the road again. Empty, only dust shifting now and then in the breeze, only cicadas starting up in the heat, only the same narrow village path stretching away between bamboo and field. Still, the anticipation stayed. By afternoon, the sun had turned richer, warmer, laying honey-colored light over the yard and the road beyond it. Sung Thuong stepped out onto the porch holding the hoe loosely in one hand. She had just finished another round of tending the garden when she saw someone in the distance. At first, it was only a figure, tall, steady, moving with purpose. Then the shape sharpened. A white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers, one hand carrying a simple plastic bag that swung slightly with every step, hair moved by the wind, a face she would know anywhere, under any sky. CEO Minh. Her heart reacted before her mind did. The hoe slipped from her hand and landed against the packed earth with a dull sound. She barely heard it. The world seemed to narrow instantly. The yard, the porch, the bamboo, the afternoon light, all falling back as one truth rushed forward. He was here, not imagined, not remembered. Here. Her whole face changed. Surprise first, then joy so pure she could not hide it even if she wanted to. She broke into motion without thinking, stepping off the porch and then hurrying, almost running across the yard toward him. Dust rose around her bare feet. Her dress moved in the wind. Her hair came loose around her face, but she didn't stop to fix it. Minh saw her coming and slowed. The look that came over his face was small but unmistakable, a rare, quiet smile that softened everything in him. The plastic bag in his hand looked almost absurdly ordinary against the way her heart was beating. She reached him breathless. For 1 second, they just stood there. Sung Thuong tried to speak, but the words didn't come. She only stared at him as if she had been walking through an ordinary afternoon and suddenly found something she had secretly been hoping for without admitting it even to herself. Minh lifted the plastic bag slightly. "I brought this for you," he said. His voice was low and warm, and because he said it so simply, the gesture hit her even harder. She looked down. Fresh pork. Good pork, too. Cut cleanly. The kind she never bought for herself unless there was a real reason. "For me?" she asked, almost foolishly. Minh gave the faintest nod. "For you." She reached for the bag, and as her fingers brushed his, both of them stilled for a fraction of a second. It was such a small touch, barely anything, and yet it moved through her like heat. The bag itself was cool, the meat inside fresh from the market, carrying that clean, raw scent of village trade in late afternoon errands. She held it close to her chest as if holding onto the happiness that came with it. "Should I grill it for you?" she asked, and the question came out softer than she meant it to. Min's smile deepened. "I'd like that." She turned at once and led him into the yard, her steps suddenly lighter than they had been all day. He followed without hesitation. The little rural kitchen, with its clay stove and low roof and smoke-dark corners, seemed different the moment he stepped inside. Smaller, yes, but also warmer, fuller, as though the room itself recognized that solitude had just been interrupted by something much kinder. Sung Thuong set the pork on the chopping board and opened the bag. The rich pink color of the meat gleamed under the slanting light. She picked up the knife and began slicing, though her eyes kept lifting toward him every few seconds, almost in disbelief that he was still there. He stood close beside her, not speaking much, only watching, and the closeness made the whole kitchen feel charged with something far deeper than conversation. Outside, the bamboo leaves kept whispering in the wind. Inside, the fire had not even been lit yet, but the day had already changed. Sung Thuong crouched by the stove and fed a few dry sticks into the mouth of the fire. A second later, the first flame caught, then another, and soon a low orange glow began to pulse beneath the blackened grate. Smoke curled upward and thin, twisting ribbons before finding its way out through the gaps near the roof. The kitchen filled with the scent of wood, ash, and fresh pork, and with Minh standing there beside her, the little room seemed to hold more warmth than it ever had before. She moved quickly after that, because working was easier than thinking too much. The pork was sliced evenly, not too thick, not too thin. She seasoned it simply but carefully: salt, a little fish sauce, chopped lemongrass, crushed garlic, pepper. Nothing extravagant, nothing city fancy. Just a kind of flavor that belonged to smoke, dusk, and people who knew how to make a meal feel like comfort. Minh watched her hands as they moved, efficient and sure. And for a second, he forgot everything else: the calls from work, the construction site, the pressure waiting for him somewhere beyond the bamboo grove. Here, the only thing that mattered was the woman beside the stove and the strange peace that settled over him whenever he stood too close to her. "Can I help?" he asked. Sung Thuong looked up, a faint smile already forming. "You might make it worse." "That sounds like a challenge." She laughed softly and handed him the palm leaf fan. "Then fan the fire, slowly. If you do it too hard, the ashes will fly." Minh took the fan with exaggerated seriousness, as if he had just been entrusted with a critical corporate responsibility. He crouched beside the stove and began fanning the coals. The first few strokes were far too strong. Ash lifted and swirled, and Sung Thuong had to turn her face away to avoid the smoke. "I told you slowly," she said, laughing again. He looked mildly offended. "I'm adjusting. You're making a storm, a controlled one." That made her shake her head, still smiling, and the sound of it, their voices, her quiet laughter, the crackle of firewood blended into something almost dreamlike. The pork began to hiss the moment she laid the first pieces across the wire grate. Fat dripped onto the hot coals, and the smell changed instantly, growing richer, deeper, irresistible. Smoke thickened, carrying the sharp fragrance of lemongrass and garlic through the kitchen and out into the yard. For a few minutes, they worked without much talking. She turned the meat, one piece at a time, patient and focused. He kept the fire even, adjusting his movements now that he understood the rhythm. Every now and then, their shoulders brushed in the cramped space. Neither of them stepped away. Once, when both reached for the same skewer at the same time, their fingers touched and stayed there for a second longer than necessary. Not because either of them meant to hold on, because neither seemed in any hurry to let the moment go. "You do this well," Minh said at last. Sung Thuong lowered her eyes to the grill. "It's just grilled meat." "No," he said quietly. "I mean all of it. This, the house, the garden, the way you make things feel alive." That caught her off guard in a way compliments about beauty never could. Her cheeks warmed, and she ducked her head slightly, as if the stove were suddenly more interesting than his face. "Anyone could do it," she murmured. Minh looked at her profile in the firelight and knew that wasn't true. Not everyone could take a small, lonely place and turn it into something that felt warm the second you entered it. Not everyone could make ordinary food feel like care. Not everyone could stand in the middle of a hard life and still laugh as softly and brightly as she did. He wanted to say all of that. Instead, he only said, "I don't think so." The silence that followed was not awkward. It had become that way between them more and more often lately. They no longer needed to fill every gap with questions. There was comfort in simply sharing the same space, the same task, the same stretch of fading daylight. Outside, the world was quiet except for bamboo leaves shifting in the wind and the occasional call of a bird finding its way home before dark. Inside, the kitchen glowed orange from the fire, and the pork slowly turned gold and brown under Sung Thuong's careful hands. They talked in fragments after that. About the weather, about the young piglets, about whether the garden would need more water if the dry spell lasted. About the city, where Minh said every day felt like 10 people were all pulling on the same hour from different directions. Sung Thuong listened, turning skewers slowly. Then why come here after work? Minh answered without thinking. Because this feels real. The words fell into the room and stayed there. Sung Thuong didn't respond immediately. She just looked at the meat, then at the fire, then at him. There was no teasing in her face now, only something quieter, deeper, as if a door inside her had opened a little wider. By the time the pork was done, the sky outside had turned from gold to indigo. She lifted each piece carefully onto banana leaves, adding herbs beside them in neat little bunches. The juices still glistened on the surface. Minh stood back and looked at the finished plate with the satisfaction of a man who had done very little and still somehow felt involved in a small miracle. They carried the food outside. The table in the yard was simple, made old by weather and use, but under the first silver wash of moonlight, it felt almost beautiful. A thin moon had risen above the bamboo grove, and the night breeze now moved more freely, cooling the heat that had settled on their skin from the fire. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then gave up on whatever had disturbed it. They sat facing each other. Sung Thuong reached first, placing a piece of grilled pork onto his plate. Minh looked at it, then at her, and without a word placed an even larger piece on hers. She smiled. He smiled back. They began to eat slowly, not because the food needed caution, but because neither of them wanted the moment to move too fast. The pork was smoky, tender, touched with lemongrass and pepper. The herbs made everything brighter. The whole meal tasted of labor, fire, and evening arriving at exactly the right pace. For a while, they only talked lightly. Minh told a story from the city about a meeting that had gone so wrong it became funny only afterward. Sung Thuong laughed so hard at one point that she had to lean one hand against the table. Then she began telling him about the piglet that kept escaping the pen and the time she chased it halfway to the stream with a basket over her head because it had started raining too suddenly to do anything else. He listened to her the way he always did now, completely. Not politely, not distractedly, not with the half attention of someone waiting for his turn to speak. He listened like every detail mattered, because it came from her. That alone made her say more than she usually would have. Small dreams, small fears. The kind of hope she had once kept locked away because there had seemed no point in giving them shape. I want the garden fuller next season, she said after a while. Not just enough to eat, enough to sell a little more, enough that the house feels secure. It will, Minh said. She looked at him. You always sound certain. He thought about that. Not always, just when it's about you. The crickets seemed louder after that. Neither of them looked away immediately. By the time the plates were nearly empty, the night had settled fully around them. The yard felt held inside something soft and private, cut off from the world beyond the bamboo. Sung Thuong leaned back slightly and looked up at the stars between the leaves. Minh watched her instead. The moonlight touched the line of her cheek, the curve of her shoulder, the place at the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat lightly. Then, very quietly, he reached into his pocket. When he drew his hand back out, there was a small box in it, deep red, elegant. The kind of box that did not belong in a poor yard under a bamboo grove and yet somehow, tonight, belonged nowhere else. Sung Thuong saw it immediately. The breath left her chest. Her eyes dropped to the box, then lifted to him, then lowered again. Her heart was beating so hard now she thought he must be able to hear it. Minh opened the box. Inside, resting against the pale lining, was a gold necklace. Fine, delicate. At its center hung a small heart-shaped pendant that caught the moonlight and gave it back in a soft golden gleam. For a second, Sung Thuong could not move. She had never received anything like it in her life. Not because it was expensive, though she knew it must be. Because it was chosen, seen, meant. "I want to give you this," Min said. His voice had changed, lower now, roughened slightly by feeling he was not trying to hide anymore. Tears filled her eyes at once. She lifted one hand to cover her mouth, then let it fall again because that somehow felt too far away from what she was feeling. Min rose from his chair and stepped around the table. She remained seated, looking up at him with a kind of stunned softness he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He moved behind her and gently gathered her hair to one side. His fingers brushed the back of her neck, warm and careful. The chain was cool when it touched her skin. He fastened it slowly, and when the clasp clicked shut, the small heart pendant settled against her collarbone as if it had always belonged there. Sung Thuong touched it with trembling fingertips. The metal was cool at first, then warm from her skin. When she looked up at him again, the tears had already fallen. He did not speak, neither did she. She stood suddenly and went straight into his arms. There was no hesitation left in it now. She wrapped both arms around him and held on with the full force of everything she had been trying to contain: gratitude, relief, tenderness, disbelief, love. Her head found his chest, and beneath her cheek, his heartbeat was strong and steady and entirely real. Min held her just as tightly. One hand moved slowly over her back. The other came up to cradle the back of her head. The yard, the moonlight, the bamboo, the crickets, the empty plates on the table, all of it remained, but none of it mattered in the same way anymore. The world had narrowed to this embrace and the understanding inside it. No grand declaration, no dramatic vow, only truth. The necklace gleamed softly at her throat. The moonlight silvered the edge of his shoulder, and under the wide, quiet sky, two people stood wrapped in each other's warmth, knowing that whatever had been growing between them in small glances, shared meals, and quiet returns had now finally stepped into the open. They did not let go for a long time. At sunrise, Sung Thuong moves through her quiet countryside routine, sweeping the yard, feeding the pigs, tending the garden, trying to hold on to the peace of a simple life. Yet beneath that calm, her heart senses that something different is coming. By late afternoon, CEO Min appears at her gate carrying fresh pork, and the ordinary day instantly changes. Overjoyed, she invites him inside, and together they prepare a rustic grilled dinner in her small kitchen. As flames crackle and smoke rises, their bond deepens through gentle laughter, quiet conversation, and the comfort of simply sharing space. Later, under the moonlit bamboo grove, they eat slowly and talk about their lives, hopes, and the strange peace they find in each other. Then the night reaches its emotional peak. Min opens a small red box and places a gold heart necklace around her neck. Overwhelmed, Sung Thuong throws herself into his arms, and beneath the stars, their love finally becomes undeniable.